Welcome back to video number 2 in week 9 of FMCS 1000, and our topic is convergence. So, in the first video, I tried to define convergence and talk about the platform era in which we're living in our present day media and culture. In this video, I'm going to move to talk about what I'm calling nomadic screen culture, which is, I guess, the more intimate and face-to-face reality for all of us when it comes to both consuming but also producing the media worlds and the culture worlds that we inhabit on a daily basis. Next week, you'll discuss what we often call multi-platforming of texts and story worlds across a given franchise. Today, in the present day, in other words, with the increasingly interconnected media of Hollywood, TV, etc., paratext materials such as online videos and so forth, and including, of course, extensive marketing. With all of this, it is less clear than ever where and what the text is, where it starts and ends. So when I say the text, what I mean is the notion of a particular film or TV series or episode thereof, etc. So starting with elaborate press campaigns for Hollywood films at the very dawn of Hollywood, around about 90 years ago, and then, 100 years ago in fact now, then complicated by the mass take-up of TV in the 1950s, as more and more films were watched on television, audiovisual texts became more than one thing. So what I mean by that is of course, as soon as you have television, film is no longer the exclusive source of audiovisual texts. And so this complex, dance, if you like, between different forms, and in some ways the convergence between them started to begin. As I've also suggested, though, this really goes back to some rather elaborate advertising campaigns at the very dawn of Hollywood. This question of a film's location and identification, which is tricky enough as a result of television, as I've suggested, then became more complicated once more with the increasingly multimedia marketing blitzkriegs and tie-ins that we saw with films like Psycho and the Birds, Hitchcock's big hits from the early 60s, and then of course with the dawn of the franchise era that we saw with films like Jaws and Star Wars, and later the Matrix films. And of course, by the time we get to the Matrix films, the famously or infamously, the so-called blitzkrieg marketing actually required a higher budget than the film itself. So, we're really asking in all of these instances, where exactly is the film? And on what screen does it perhaps exist? So the digital era, which has been a gradual revolution in production, distribution, and consumption, complicates all this anew. As I said in the first video, it gives convergence its real opportunity to come into its own, if you like, as full convergence replaces distinct media forms and platforms. And as I mentioned in the first video, if you'd like to hear more on what we mean by the digital, and also some complications in the form of the post-digital, as well as the concept of the virtual, you can have a look at the relevant clip, the selected clip from the Echo lecture. So in addition to historically familiar temporal and spatial questions, what is a film or a TV show when you watch it online? So what I mean by that is that, a TV show or a film is already complicated in terms of where it exists, where the text resides. But now when we watch it online, of course, that is even more the case. Can we still differentiate audiovisual media into these different forms? So, for example, film and television, when we increasingly experience such texts via the exact same devices and technology. So for a long time now, we've often watched films and TV on the same screen. And indeed, some television even special television sometimes gets simulcast or broadcast or played in a movie type environment. So, for example, the Cannes Film Festival this year, I think for the first time, is including some television. Our proliferating screens, which are no longer tethered to a cinema or domestic living room, of course, complicate all of this in a really fundamental way. Even going to the cinema today is like watching a giant digital TV. We no longer, unless it's a very unusual cinema these days, it no longer is a question of wearing celluloid behind us, but of course digital bits It's like watching a Blu-ray in many ways, just delivered off a hard drive. And our own screens at home, be they big or small, have become like home cinemas or mobile screening facilities alike that equalize all texts. So whether we're watching a classic film or a new Netflix series or some video that your friend made and uploaded to YouTube, we're watching all of these things on the same kinds of screens. Increasingly, mobile screens are now the central consumption and even production sites or axes for our convergence era. So yes, in some cases people are buying large televisions, but the real action is actually in this more mobile screen culture. So watching films on portable screens is and has become very significant for media studies. But this is not the first time in history that the moving image's size and dimensions have been significantly transformed. So television itself prompted the invention of widescreen aspect ratios and projection for cinemas in the 1950s, for example. That's where the frame stopped being basically square and became kind of elongated. We had multi-screen and multi-dimension experiments in the 1970s, where films, were in all kinds of crazy shapes and sizes. That's at the more experimental end, of course, of film production. We had widescreen and digital television introduction in the 1990s and noughties. And of course, we have, as I've been saying, the increasing use of computers and now tablets and phones to watch our films and TV shows. So all of these different changes have brought about some changes in the size and dimension of the screen. But nonetheless, we shouldn't underestimate the significance of our present moment. Our multi and mobile screen era, the changes involved in that era are indeed substantial. And they fundamentally impact how, when and where we watch, but also how we make films and television, if such distinctions are still viable. Of course, also, as I said in the first video, it fundamentally transforms what we watch and when we choose to watch it. We're no longer, if you like, victims of the whims of the distributors who choose a very small selection of movies, for example, that used to be shown on free-to-air TV networks. Although, as I mentioned in the first video, we are still, of course, beholden to the rights decisions and the commercial distribution decisions that Netflix or Stan or whatever streaming service or services we subscribe to have made. In addition to consumption devices, interestingly, now these screens are truly production centers with all the qualities of Web 2.0, in other words, the interactive web, social media, etc., but also thereby cinema and TV 2.0 as well. In the process, slowly chipping away at their textural and formal borders. In other words, we're living increasingly in a multi-screen but also a multi-production environment where it perhaps doesn't make a lot of sense to make strict distinctions between things like cinema and television, but also we're living in a world where increasingly we can make films and TV shows of our own for not very much money on the same devices, in fact, that we use to watch them. This is in some ways, the cinema 2.0, the TV 2.0 dimension. But in addition to that, it's the tendency, as I mentioned at the beginning of the first video, for us to have multiple screens going at the same time, or multiple screens open on our one device, so that we'll be, social media. We'll be doing social media at the same time as watching a TV show, and perhaps even, watching it with others in other parts of the world, live, as it were. So the tablet and mobile era has rejuvenated film, video and TV in their different modes, size and dimension of screen diversity, plus different length of audiovisual text. It's sometimes mentioned, for example, that short films and videos or shows work better on phones. So that applies to the world of experimental or independent production, but also I think in some ways to the world of streaming. And I've noticed that some of the streaming services there's been an increase, I think, in some shorter shows. So sort of 20-minute, half an hour episodes in some prominent programs recently, possibly reflecting the use of small screens. That's just a sort of anecdotal comment, something that I've noticed. I don't know if there's any statistics to back that up. But it's interesting to think about, concentration and screen size. So some people have suggested that short is good for a small screen, I'm not sure. When watching a film or video material on a phone, we are removed from the ritualistic, what some people call Cinema 1.0 experience, in regards to portability, but also the centrality of the device itself. When you go to a cinema, it's almost like a religious experience in the sense that it's dark, a mysterious kind of image and soundtrack emerges as if out of nowhere, and you're kind of beholden to it. So as opposed to the projector behind you in a cinema, when we watch something on a tablet or a phone, the role of the screen is impossible to ignore, as it predominantly encases an image that is significantly smaller than its appearance at the cinema or even on TV. It fits in our hand in many respects. The screen is uniquely prominent in our field of vision and embedded in our own hand, thereby de-emphasizing the frame, or at least it's merging with our flesh, our fingers, etc., as opposed to the frame's crucial role in the cinema or watching TV as highlighted and bordered by black. So some theorists are really interested in the way the image itself is being transformed as we consume it, as not being something that's sort of removed from everyday life, but in fact increasingly part of our own bodies in that kind of way. So finally, phones and tablets emphasize cinema's virtuality, which again I'll discuss in that echo clip, in a very different way within the context of an increasingly nomadic media culture. And I'll discuss virtuality and the digital in that clip, free from the religious space of cinema. I want to say religious, I don't mean literally, it's kind of a metaphor. You know, it's like going to church in a secular way, and you know, you have this magical sort of experience. So digital platforms encourage networked global connection with others, meaning that media experience is increasingly shared, of course, and socially inflected via chatting, as I mentioned, at the same time as we watch a film or a TV show, with multiple screens within our screen, or possibly multiple screens within our lounge room, if we might have the film or show on the big screen and then we've got our little phone or tablet with, you know, Facebook open or something like that. So on the one hand, we are increasingly alone watching our film or TV show, unlike in the cinema or family lounge room. We're watching shows that we alone have chosen to watch, not that we've had to negotiate with our friends or family, etc. Yet we're also increasingly connected to the virtual and therefore social reality of both images themselves and the internet itself. So it's an interesting kind of, you know, double movement there. And again, I'll discuss that a bit more in the echo on virtuality. The personally embedded nature of the device encourages a sense of immersion, extending communication to both physical and therefore very real and intimate, but also virtual spaces that are beyond our immediate environment. Most notably the internet itself, but also the realm of fantasy, for example. So as I say, if you'd like to hear more on the digital and the virtual, have a listen to those echo clips, and thanks very much for watching.